Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. My last video on the best non-fiction books I've read this year that were released in 2020 was quite long, and there are so many other books I wanted to talk about that weren't released in 2020 but that I read this year that I really wanted to share and talk to you about. So here are some of my absolute favorite non-fiction books released another time, not this year, that I have sat and enjoyed this year. And so now to some other of my top books from this year, but just ones that weren't released in 2020. So kicking us off, we have Natives by Akala. So this is a book that really looks at Akala's personal life and his sort of growth as a young child, particularly a young mixed race child growing up in Britain. And some of the challenges he had in sort of reconciling various parts of his identity, but also a really vital and essential kind of portrait of what it was like being a young black boy essentially in the UK, in terms of stop and search, in terms of how teachers treated him, about some of the various discussions he's had to have with people throughout his life. He does a really good job of completely unpicking some of the key arguments used against people of colour when they articulate their experiences of racism in the UK. So whether that's kind of colour blindness, whether that is in terms of the good that the empire did not, whether that's in terms of many other discussions, is really powerfully done, and there's such a strong and vital voice all the way through. Also, a book that made me realise something that I had not realised before, which is that Akala and Miss Dynamite are brother and sister, which I had never realised, and that completely blew my mind, where he just sort of casually refers to her. It's like, oh yeah, my sister, Miss Dynamite. I was like, sorry, what? But yes, really well done. And you just kind of get, for me, I'd sort of seen a couple of his videos of him talking about various topics, and I completely got how he had managed to get to this sort of platform, because he so brilliantly pinpoints the issues. He's, you know, some people will kind of talk around it for a while. He's very good at kind of cutting to the chase and being like, actually, here's the assumption behind what this person is saying, or here's why this is an issue. Brilliantly done, and highly recommended. Another book I really enjoyed this year was Jonny Pitts with Afropean. So this is a book where Jonny Pitts, himself a black man, travels through various parts of Europe looking for where there are communities of colour, particularly communities created by sort of African diaspora. And so you get this really interesting portrait of kind of areas that you otherwise kind of really wouldn't hear of. So whether that's, you know, a small community in Berlin or in Paris or Amsterdam or various other parts, he really goes into depth into how these communities have not only created a strong sense of community and identity for themselves, but also how they've had to do that in the, again, against a backdrop of racist discrimination, of intolerance, and often of kind of quite a large amount of hardship. You know, communities who have come to these countries perhaps with not very much money, but have managed to create something that is a family for the people around them. It's really well observed. He gets a really interesting set of people interviewed, but also does a really great job of picking communities that are kind of perhaps less obvious, I want to say. So, you know, not only the capital cities of Europe, but also a housing estate kind of a few, you know, a bit away from Paris in France. And particularly that being a housing estate where the residents have long been kind of ignored. It almost kind of feels like the wealth and the kind of influence or whatever of Paris and of France more generally hasn't managed to reach them. Instead, they've kind of just been left there, and they've kind of created their own community, but also they're a very heavily policed community. So really powerfully done, very interesting. And I think it's so great to kind of broaden that kind of perspective, because these, I have to admit, these are not things I've really spent much time thinking about. You know, I know about some of the communities in the UK, particularly in London, where I'm based and where I'm from, where, you know, there might be sort of communities from certain kind of countries or certain diaspora kind of coming together. but I hadn't really ever thought about what that looks like in, for example, St. Petersburg or in Stockholm or wherever else. And so, yeah, really powerfully done. The next book I really want to highly recommend is Kiese Laymon's Heavy, which is a memoir of him talking a lot about his experiences, not only as a black man in the US, but really intertwining that with his relationship with his body. And what's really interesting about that is sort of how, you know, when, for example, he gained weight at various times, him in a black man's body would be treated kind of differently according to various things. So him becoming bigger would, to some people, make him seem more of a threat, kind of along the lines of kind of racist tropes and stereotypes around the kind of the aggressive black man or what have you. And what he does so powerfully, I think, is really interweave not only the kind of societal picture about what it means to be a black man in America, or what it means to be sort of in a larger body in the US and sort of more generally, but also how his relationship with food and his body and his mother, and these really personal, very in real detail, and like how all of these things impact his life. The story about him and his mother and their relationship is just heartbreaking. I raced through the final bit of this book because I did not want to like stop and put this down and leave this world, and I couldn't face the idea of not knowing the kind of end bit of the story with him and his mother. It's a heartbreaking tale. You know, his mum spirals into problems with addiction. He's got his own addictions in terms of food and gambling, and it combines in this really interesting narrative that is, I mean, this is incredible writing. Like, I don't think I've seen writing like this in a really long time, where someone is so open and I don't really know almost what the word is. It's so raw and visceral. And he just tells this story with such power. And it's weird because I keep on thinking that I listened to this as an audiobook, and I didn't. I read it, and yet I kind of feel like I heard his voice through it, which sounds maybe a bit much, but I saw this in the library. I'd heard it recommended before, and I was like, sod it, I'm going to grab it. And I'm so glad I did, because I felt like I was hearing this entire novel through his voice. It's so well crafted. I just think it's stunning. I think it's one of those books that is just beyond words almost. It's so good. Pick it up and read it. It's great. And I, again, would really love to see what Kiese Laymon, I'm probably saying his name wrongly, writes again in future, because it's going to be incredible. Next up is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. Now, this is a book I'd heard a little bit of and had kind of been bounced around, and it was only really because of a book club that I finally ended up reading it. And it was completely not what I expected. So in it, Maggie Nelson talks a lot about her own personal experiences of kind of her sexuality and her gender, and particularly her kind of feelings upon becoming a mother. And it's interlaced with this story of her partner who transitions. And so she is sort of working out now what that means in terms of her own identity and sexuality, in that her partner is male, and, you know, when she entered the relationship, that's not how they were, at least publicly, identifying or presenting. And what is really powerful for me is it almost shouldn't work on paper, this book. It's a kind of personal memoir around pregnancy, around gender, around sexuality, and it's interlaced with all of this kind of critical theory, so feminist queer theory, and lots of kind of intersecting kind of narratives, and occasionally it'll cut from you know, talking about being kind of there and, you know, giving birth and that feeling, and then it'll cut to kind of speaking about an artist whose career was sort of seemed to go downhill after she gave birth because people found her less interesting or less exciting or whatever, and then interlacing that with theories around women's bodies and whatever else. And so it almost looks like it shouldn't work, and it's tough going in some ways, because you've got to keep kind of engaging with quite critical theory, and for me it's been a while since I really read that kind of level of feminist and queer theory. So yeah, it's a lot in some ways, but I just think it's so effective. She is such a genius writer, at kind of pulling out all these little threads along the way, and then these kind of connections that you wouldn't necessarily immediately think of, and then she links these two things and you're like, of course, this is completely logical and sensible. I think this is wonderful. This is but I totally now see what the buzz has been about this book for several years. It is great, and I highly recommend Argonauts by Maggie. Next up is The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein. So this book I thought was really interesting, and completely one that I hadn't heard of, and really did not know what to expect. I kind of just found it through an app for audiobooks, kind of via libraries, called BorrowBox, and they just sort of had this sort of list of audiobooks that had been sort of released recently or that people seem to enjoy, and it's called The Trauma Cleaner, and it, on the surface, again, doesn't really sound like something I would have immediately gone for, and I almost didn't pick it up. And then when I did download it, I thought maybe I won't listen to it. So it's all about somebody, this kind of woman who runs a cleaning operation, and the cleaning operation itself is basically deep, heavy cleaning after trauma events. So that is, for example, things like a suicide or a murder, or someone leaving a house to go into disrepair after many years. And it really digs into how, for many of the people who are affected by this, so particularly obviously the ones who haven't been murdered or didn't take their own lives, the psychological support needed for those people is kind of comes hand in hand with the cleaning. So it's not just, I'm going to turn up and tidy your house after, you've just watched someone die, or after you've sort of let this place go into rack and ruin for 20 years after a traumatic event. These things need to be kind of addressed at the same time. And so this cleaner is somebody who just has this really natural ability to connect with people, and, whilst kind of essentially saying, so for example, there's an example with somebody who has sort of been hoarding and has let a lot of things fall by the wayside, and there's this sort of set of rats, and she doesn't want to see them killed, and most other cleaners, when they've come in, have basically just like blitzed the entire place, killed all the rats, all of those kinds of things, and that left this woman more traumatized and more inclined to hold on to everything she had, because you've got all these rats that have she doesn't want to see killed again, right? So this cleaner comes in and is really sort of supportive and kind and looking after her, and kind of saying, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do this to look after the rats, and we're going to tidy up this corner of the flat, and keeping it really basic and focusing on the needs of the client. And it's just so that alone would have been really interesting and really powerful, and that's kind of what I thought it might be, but it goes into this way more depth about this woman herself, who's this person doing it, and her life as someone who has sort of been variously in her life, a young gay man shunned by parents, to someone taking part in drag, to then kind of actually identifying as a trans woman, and kind of the various sort of bits of their life. And again, it's kind of unsparing. She doesn't, the author doesn't really go into much, it doesn't leave much out. So she's perfectly happy in some ways to present quite a broad picture of this person. So this woman is troubled and flawed and brilliant and empathetic, but also cold, and this really in-depth discussion of who she is. And I think that's what's just so brilliant about it, is it doesn't paint this kind of hero picture, and it doesn't demonize her. It really fleshes out this warm, flawed human, and I just think it's beautiful. Next up was another audiobook, which was David France's How to Survive a Plague, which felt very timely this year, but speaks a lot about the HIV and AIDS crisis, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and how sort of times shifted until the point where we're at now, where although we don't have a cure, there is a lot more greater public awareness of what HIV and AIDS are, although a lot more work still needs to be done on that. But we do have medicine and treatment that mean that people can survive and live a happy and healthy life. And particularly if they're on effective medication, that they can't transmit HIV to other people, even with unprotected sex. And that is a big, we're talking sort of 30 years for a lot of that progress to have happened in, which is a long time. And obviously more action earlier on would have meant that far fewer people died. But it's also amazing to see how far so many things have come. And I mean, absolutely brilliant book. I do recommend the audiobook. It's quite a long book. And so I think the audiobook is probably quite good for being able to just sort of let it wash over you, because there's a lot to hear about. But yes, I mean, brilliantly done. So powerful. And I really, really do think that this is the kind of book that we need to kind of be reading a lot more, to kind of really understand about the historical kind of story. I mean, it sounds a bit contradictory, the history of such a powerful and destructive time in civilization. Next up is a book by Augusten Burroughs, who is already an author I adore. His novel Television, I think, has probably made me cackle more than any other book I've read. His memoirs are always both a really powerful combination of heartbreaking and raw and really funny, kind of able to find the humor in all the darkness. And this book, This Is How, is a bit of a self-help guide and book in many ways. I mean, again, it's also worth doing the audiobook just to have Augusten Burroughs read it to you. But I think it's just so brilliant in so many ways, because Augusten Burroughs has been through a lot and uses those levels of understanding to really help support people. But it's also not a sort of self-help book in the kind of traditional sense of, really empty, meaningless things about like find your core, or like, I don't know, I just made that up, but like meaningless phrase. I should make a book of that. I could make millions. But really meaningless things that just kind of direct you to the next self-help book. I think it's sort of often a thing that I've seen people talk about, where when people automatically rate a self-help book and say, wow, this changed my life, that shouldn't be the case, right? Because in the hour since you read the book, it can't really have changed your life. What happens is the work that comes next, right? And I think what's really powerful about Augusten Burroughs with this book is he doesn't kind of claim to be trying to change your life. Instead, it's kind of, right, you're in a crisis. Here are some kind of things that might comfort you and support you. And then here's me guiding you towards what you might want to start thinking about next in terms of getting yourself some support. And Augusten Burroughs has been through abuse and addiction and so many other things. And I think that's what makes it so powerful, is it isn't trying to claim to have the silver bullet that will solve all your problems. Instead, it's just a bit of an emotional check-in in some ways of, hey, here are some things that people can find quite tough. Here's how you might start thinking about how you can find help for yourself. And that's what I think is so brilliant about this book. And finally, I want to finish off this list with 3 memoirs that I have found really powerful and insightful in really quite different ways. So the first is On Writing by Stephen King, which is part memoir and part guide to being a better writer. I found it really helpful in both senses. It's really interesting. I haven't read all that much by Stephen King, if any, actually. And I found it really great that not only is his rules and kind of guide for writing, not only are they so kind of blunt and to the point, but he's also really perfectly willing to understand how you get to various other parts and kind of to tell you a bit about his life and what led him to writing, so that it doesn't feel like it's just a how-to guide. I mean, I think that's what's really effective about it. And I'd been kind of hearing really positive things about it for years, but kind of shied away from it, thinking that because Stephen King writes different novels to the kinds of novels that I write, that would mean that it was, you know, I think I thought it was more of a how-to for his style of novel, and I thought that's not necessarily something I want. Like, I don't want to write about those things, and I realized how stupid all of that was, because he's giving really solid writing tips that are actually good. So I'm going to take those forward. But he also talks a lot about his childhood and being in quite a severe car accident where he thought he was going to die, and how those two things have shaped him as well. So that was really great. And I'm reading that as part of a crazy writing course that I'll be part of in January, which I'm very, very excited about. Also on the reading list for that course was Giving Up the Ghost by Hilary Mantel. Now, Hilary Mantel, I hadn't read anything from apart from the Wolf Hall trilogy. And I had heard a lot of people talking about how a lot of her other work was really well worth reading. But her memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, is again part writing guide, but mostly memoir. And for me, I just thought it was stunning. Now, her writing style in particularly Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light, I thought was amazing. But there's something about the confessional nature of her memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, that I just thought was brilliant. Like, the title comes from the idea that as a kid she kind of felt that there were all these ghosts, but it's also her idea of kind of excising these ghosts from her life, you know, giving up shame, giving up kind of caring about sort of certain things that aren't helping her. But I had no idea about her life. You know, she fell very, very ill for a really long time. It has affected her in so many ways. She's gone from being kind of quite a slim, short young child to a woman who suddenly gained quite a lot of weight through her illness, and how that really changed how she saw the world, how she saw herself. It meant also that she couldn't have children, and that really affected how she saw herself in terms of her identity, in terms of her womanhood, in terms of so many other things, and in terms of how people treated her. I really urge you to read it. I just think it's like there's something so spare about her writing, but it says so much. You almost don't need her to go into detail about so many of these parts, because she does so much with just a three-word sentence, you know, and suddenly it cuts through everything. And I mean, she's fantastic. I now am realizing that I need to go back and read far more of her work, of her fiction, because clearly there's something there that I hadn't kind of necessarily realized with Wolf Hall. There's a whole other rawness and tenderness that is just so brilliant. And I just so highly recommend this. And finally, a book that I absolutely adored this year, and I think as an audiobook is really worth hearing, because it's so it's a book that you want to sit back and let wash over you, and that is Salt Path by Raynor Winn. I'd seen this book in bookshops everywhere, and she released I think The Wild Silence this year, which I really want to get around to listening to or reading. And it kind of concerns, basically, her life was sort of completely turned upside down. Her and her husband were kicked out of the farm that they were on due to a financial dispute. And there's this really heartbreaking moment early on where she basically realizes that the evidence that she's got in her hands in this courtroom that would completely prove that she doesn't have to pay this money and that she's fine and everything isn't accepted, because it was kind of presented too late, and she doesn't realize that because she doesn't have a lawyer and doesn't have whatever else, and as a result her whole life is thrown into disarray. And her husband, basically around that exact same time, is sort of diagnosed with quite a severe illness or kind of problem that's really been affecting his health, and he's advised to spend a lot of time sitting down and not moving around too much and not doing anything too strenuous. However, they decide to walk a coastal path that's about 630 miles. So, you know, a bit of exercise. And they do this with basically no money, and out of absolute desperation. They have nowhere to go. And so they kind of just think, you know what, let's just spend some time while we try and work out anything that's going to happen next, doing this long walk. Let's see what happens. And it's so visceral the whole way through, just how little money they have. So they will watch people eating a bag of chips and envy them, or, you know, they'll kind of consider it a treat to spend 50p on something, and they go through so much of this journey on like noodles and what have you. And they, along the way, they depend so much on the kindness of strangers, but it's also such a beautiful look at nature and their absolute fascination with the nature that they pass. You know, 630 miles of coastline and rugged outcrops and all these beautiful, beautiful things that they've finally got the time to really sit and enjoy because they are free, and they don't have anything else really holding them back. But also, they have no security. They don't know what's going to happen next. You know, losing a bag would mean so many horrible things to them. So they're actively holding on to everything they've got, and their whole life is so precarious. And, you know, I was kind of worrying about their children throughout it, because they haven't really got, you know, this couple haven't got their, well, they've got a phone, but they need to charge it every so often, and they can't make any calls out on it. They have to have people calling them, and they won't hear it while they're hiking and all these kinds of things. And their kids are at uni, and they're just really hoping for the best. It's heartbreaking in so many ways, but I think is just so well told. The writer never really sits and feels sorry for herself, but equally she doesn't pretend that it's nothing. And ultimately it just gets to this beautiful end that's both very, very sad in terms of some of the circumstances, but almost feels so joyous. Anytime they have a win or something to celebrate, you celebrate with them. And it's just one of the most stunning things I've read in recent years. I just think it's brilliant. And so those are all of the non-fiction books I've read this year. Thank you so much for sticking with me rambling about all of them. I hope that you pick up some of these and enjoy them. Please leave any recommendations in the comments as well. I would love to hear them. And thank you so much. I really hope you've had a good 2020, as much as that's been possible. And I hope you're looking forward to a really good 2021. All my very, very best. And thank you very much. Enjoy your reading. Bye-bye.